Hello, everyone. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience. And mostly thanks to my mom, one of the first serious scientific topics that I explored in a serious way, well, as serious as tiny little fledgling human can, was evolution. And I always describe the research that I did as focusing on the neurobiology of mood, anxiety, and addiction. Um, but if I'm being completely honest, the real inspiration for my research was understanding the evolutionary history of a particular circuit in the brain that's been in an animal of some sort on Earth for at least 350 million years. The medial habenula interpeduncular nucleus axis, which you can see right here. So this is a circuit right in the middle of your brain. And it's critical to how it is that activity in the front of your brain is able to influence the middle and the back of your brain. And so do you see that lovely sort of teal colored egg thingy with a thick line going up diagonally from it? That's the circuit. And this is a picture I took with a microscope that took an embarrassingly long time to take. But the point is that essentially every animal, certainly every mammal with whom you interact or can even name, has that same exact circuit with some slight differences, but they look almost exactly the same. So that's what I was studying. I was essentially studying a short chapter in the book of human evolution. And so, the reality is that essentially every discipline in biology shares quite a few underlying motivations and goals and techniques and so on. But ultimately, they have at least one thing in common. If you're interrogating biology in a serious way, what you're also doing is adding chapters to the story of human evolution. And so today, we are very fortunate to be joined by a rising scientist about to finish their PhD at the University of Michigan, one of the top research institutions in the world, by the way, particularly for evolutionary biology, the soon-to-be Georgia Auteri. So here is Georgia.
Thank you, Ian. Soon to be Dr. Georgia Auteri. I am Georgia Auteri now, as far as I know, unless you know something.
Right.
But yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. It's great. It's interesting hearing about what specifically in the brain you're interested in. But yeah, as you mentioned, I study evolution. I'm a wildlife biologist, so usually I study evolution in non-human animals. I primarily study bats. And while we're on the topic of bats, they have actually quite small brains compared to other mammals because, they have to cut down on weight because they're flying around. But yeah, it's cool to get to talk about other mammals and also sort of a larger evolutionary time scale than I normally think of. I look a lot at sort of very short-term evolution in that the type of stuff that we can see, how we can see species genetics changing within a human lifetime, for example. So it's cool to get to zoom out sometimes and think about these bigger evolutionary pictures and how did we as a human species come to exist.
Couldn't agree more. And so we have somebody who works in evolution, and we're going to have a conversation about a recent finding of a wonderfully intact skull that has informally been dubbed Dragon Man. But we're also going to have a conversation about how we can think about this new finding, what it can teach us about our own story, but then also a broader conversation about human evolution. And so before we get too far into our topics, I have a question for anyone who might be watching. Why do you think humans live as long as we do? Obviously today, we have access to medicine and nutrition, but even our primitive ancestors lived quite a long time relative to other primates, well beyond our reproductive age, right? So why do you think that might be? We'll get into that in a little bit. Okay, so Dragon Man. So there was this recent discovery of an absolutely beautiful specimen in China of this skull that certainly seems to have added a few paragraphs, at least, to the story of human evolution. And again, it's informally dubbed the Dragon Man, not because they looked like a dragon or anything like that, just because it was discovered near the Dragon River, region of northeast China. But let's be honest, it is good marketing by the scientists who found it. So discovered hominins regularly get nicknames, by the way. We have Lucy, we have Artie, we have Merikitami Boy, the Tong Child, and they're either just friendly nicknames or they're named after where they were found. And hey, Scott, thank you so much for joining. Hey, Lucia, awesome to see you. Thank you for the award, Lisa and Lucia. Thank you. And thank you, David and Christian. Lovely to see you here.
Yeah, hello, everybody. It's good to see you. Yeah, so, and actually, speaking of these, other cool fossils, so this Dragon Man skull, it's also called the Harbin fossil. It's another name for it, I guess. But this Dragon Man skull, he was found in 1933 by someone. And that was actually, it was not that long after, I guess, the Peking Man in China was found. So apparently, like people, if you're familiar at all with this Dragon Man skull, like the stories that have been in the news about it, this Chinese man found it when he was working, I think, in construction. And he hid it in a well because he was working for the Japanese who occupied China at the time, and he didn't want to like hand it over to his Japanese boss. But apparently, because like Peking Man had just been discovered, you know, not that long before, he had it in his mind, like, wow, this is something important. And because he had heard about Peking Man, and he kind of that probably fed into, you know, his thinking and realizing the importance of this and deciding to hide it.
Yeah, it's a harrowing story. So George and I have a lot for you today, including everything from stories of many of the ancestors that led up to who we are today, why Homo sapiens evolved the way we have with our big old fancy brains, as well as some of the most critical aspects of our biology that are likely derived from viruses. We may not get to that, but we'll do our best. So let's get to it. So, okay, let's do this. I thought it might help to sort of set the stage at the beginning. Right. One of the questions that I've encountered, you know, every now and then, and certainly wondered myself, has been what came before the apes, right? Like we certainly evolved from other apes over millions of years, right? But what led up to the apes? Well, one of the leading theories where are we? Oh, I thought I had you up here. Shoot. Oh, well.
The good news is that we have a lot of photos and media to share with you all, but the bad news is it's hard to find it all because there's so much to scroll through.
Yeah. So one of it, here we go. I think I just got it. Gosh, this is unfortunate. Let me try one more time.
Well, I'll just continue, I guess, the story real quick while you're looking for that about the guy who found it, because I kind of left off, oh, it was discovered in 1933, but we're just now hearing about it, right? So why is that? Well, the guy hid it for a long time. He didn't even tell his family. So it was only in like a few years ago that I guess scientists kind of were made aware of this skull and anyone else besides the guy, I guess. So and so then they've been analyzing it supposedly for the past couple years to see what it could add to, what paragraphs, as Ian mentioned, it could add to what we know of human evolution. Did you find our great ape?
Yeah.
Yes.
The great ancestors. So one of the leading theories is that we likely emerged from like a thing that looked kind of like a rat or a shrew or like a squirrel-looking type of critter, and that those critters would have been called Purgatorius. So Purgatorius is a genus of 7 extinct species that are ultimately thought to be like ground zero of what ultimately became primates. And the first evidence of Purgatorius was found in Montana in 1965 at a place called Purgatory Hill. A very inviting name for a hill. Kind of reminds me of the Dismal Swamp in New Jersey, if you've ever heard of that place. Clearly didn't have the best real estate marketing instincts back then, but it was found in deposits that have been dated to 63 million years. Million years old, of course. And so it goes back a way. But as you can tell, it basically looks like a mouse or a squirrel. And based on its anatomy, it spent quite a fair bit of its time in trees. And so how do we know that it was likely one of our earliest ancestors? Well, if you look at its jaws and its teeth, very important part of trying to figure out this story. And importantly, the bones of the feet and ankles. They look quite a bit more like later primates than other animals who were scampering around all those millions of years ago. But if like one were to walk by you right now, you obviously wouldn't instinctively think like, oh, there goes something that'll evolve, right? Over millions of years into a primate. You know, it doesn't have our handy forward-facing eyes, giving us binocular vision, and it has claws instead of nails, like we have and our closest relatives have. And so it's called a Plesiadapiform, okay? A group of sort of primates, as far as I'm aware, and it's still sort of a debate as to in evolutionary biology as to whether they're technically primates. But fundamental to all of these discoveries and comparisons is looking for what are called synaptomorphies. And I promise I'll minimize the jargon as much as I can moving forward. But they're really just traits that are shared by 2 or more groups, right? That are inherited from a common ancestor. The more closely related 2 groups of animals are, the more of these synaptomorphies they'll share. So for Homo sapiens, they'll have opposable thumbs, nails instead of claws, forward-facing eyes. They'll be bipedal, things like that. Think about how you can sort of tell if siblings are related by just looking at them, right? Right, it's same kind of thing, right? And obviously this is easier when you're looking at twins, like Isa Beta Bug or Isa Betancourt, an entomologist who you should all follow if you don't already, and her twin sister. But if you look at siblings and parents from a family overall, you can sort of detect shared traits. And so a similar process is going on when biologists are weaving together the sort of tapestry of our evolutionary history, right? And that's the struggle when it comes to Purgatorius, right? It doesn't have those front-facing eyes enclosed in bone like we have, and that we're all taking for granted right now. But those traits had to come from somewhere, right? So Purgatorius.
Yeah. That's a cute little animal. So so that I think that should hopefully be intuitive to people. There's Ian threw out some fancy words there, but basically these fancy words all just mean that we're looking for similarities and trying to see basically what makes the most sense in terms of what's related to what's based on our observations, just the simplest story. Oh, these two people look very similar because they are related to each other very recently. But there are some differences. The metaphor of our family, pedigree type of relationships can only go so far for evolutionary relationships, because evolutionary, splitting of species is not as clear cut as a parent having two different kids, for example. And that's because with populations, with evolution, we're looking at populations of things and species. And so we can have different levels of separation that occur, different levels of interbreeding between the populations happening. And so when we think about human evolution, let's see, let me just share this image now. Let me highlight it. Yeah, so, we went away. So this image is kind of shows humans are on the far left. It's sort of like an evolutionary tree, right? Humans on the far left, and then close to us, there's Neanderthals, and then we have Denisovians nearby. And we see that these are three different groups splitting off, but there's also these black arrows going across the top of the page between them. And those black arrows are showing that there's some interbreeding happening. So that's that interbreeding is kind of the main difference, where we see that pedigrees are not the same exactly as the types of things we're thinking about in evolutionary biology. Oh,
there we go.
Why are we like this? This is not intuitive. Okay.
There we go. We got it. All right. So yeah, exactly. And it gets complicated, right? When it comes to hominins. But so that lovely little critter, right, was likely one of our early ancestors, living mostly in trees and, having some of the ingredients that may have enabled for the evolution of the traits that make a human. But the discovery of the dragon man skull isn't filling chapters of evolution dating back 65 million years, right? We're talking about around 140,000 years, just under 300,000 years ago. So a very, very long time ago, but far more recent than, when our ancestors were scampering, around trees on all fours. And so as Georgia noted, this was a discovery in Hardin, right? And this group came out with, I'll do it this way too. This group came out with three publications, two of which I have here. And the group published these three papers in a journal called The Innovation. It's a new journal, about a year old. And these are the titles, just two of them. And the group makes a pretty big claim. Right, they claim that the skull of this is the skull of a new species, right, which they call Homo longi, right, and long, that just basically means dragon in Mandarin, evidently.
I believe long means dragon, yeah.
Yeah, long, right, and the skull was discovered, in the Dragon River area, right, and so that's their claim, but the field hasn't necessarily agreed with their argument, and I know Georgia has a couple of thoughts on this.
Well, and not even that the field doesn't necessarily agree, but there's also some disagreement among the co-authors, as we found. But yeah, so basically, here's what people do agree on. The scientists agree that the skull is cool because it's so intact. Normally it's very unusual to find just a well-preserved skull like that. And it's an intact skull that's different than any other intact skulls we have. So that's definitely cool. And also all the scientists agree that it's a skull of some humanoid hominin species that's in the genus Homo, the same genus that we're in, Homo sapiens. So that in itself makes it a really, really cool find and really important to science. But yeah, not everybody agrees that it should be a new species. And it's hard. It's really hard to make these evolutionary trees when we have bits and fragments of, oop, it said connection lost for a second. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. It's hard to make these evolutionary relationships and even figure out what a species is when we have just like little bits of bone that we're on and not really good genetic data.
Right.
And not good genetic
and
or morphological data. Yeah.
Right. And so, yeah, so the team does suggest, I see David brings up a good topic, that this purported new species, that, again, they're not the entire team, as Georgia was saying, there's some good quotes from a co-author in London. But so they suggest that this new species would be more closely related to Homo sapiens, humans, than Neanderthals, right? With whom, as Georgia noted, humans interbred tens of thousands of years ago. But then other paleontologists, think that rather than being a new group of hominins, and by the way, hominins basically just refers to any member of the tribe Homininae, or Homini. And we're the only living hominin, but includes everything from Neanderthals, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, the Australopithecines. And so basically you can think of a hominin as like anything that's more closely related to us than chimps or like bonobos. And so what does it take to be a part of this exclusive club of mammals? Two sort of major things, and please, Georgia, correct me if I'm off here, but typically bipedal, and one that may be a little bit less intuitive, but the size of canine teeth are about the same size as between males and females. And so here is an example of why those criteria are used. If you look at chimp canine teeth, they're pretty ferocious, right? Look at that. And if you compare a male chimp to a female chimp, there's a pretty significant difference in their canine size. But if you compare, my teeth to my wife's teeth, canine teeth, they're about the same. And so that is sort of one of the characteristic features of being a hominin.
Yeah. So the question of is it its own species or not, and then is it our closest relative, closer to us than Neanderthals or not? Those are kind of the two really big claims that are up for debate. Yeah. And like I mentioned, yeah, like not all of the authors even agree on both of those things. So we had a question earlier from Christian about the relationship in this chart that I showed. And yeah, so it's presumed that Neanderthals are more closely related to humans, and then in this, like, Neanderthals and Denisovians are also very closely related. We do have evidence of Denisovian and Neanderthal DNA in us, in Homo sapiens. But there's, for example, one of the things that there's disagreement among scientists about is whether or not Denisovians are even all one species. And so when that debate already exists, okay, the question of whether this dragon man is or is not a Denisovian, I mean, maybe he's one of many species that we call Denisovians. The only evidence we have of Denisovians is, the only fossil evidence actually is mandible bone, so like part of the jaw, and I think some teeth and a finger, basically very tiny little pieces. And so it's you can see why it would be a really big claim then to say that this skull is definitely not a Denisovian.
Right. So these things are regularly, things like this are regularly in science, right? That's the nice thing about science, is the more information we get, the more precise we can get. But so I thought it might be fun to explore our family tree a bit, and I know Georgia most definitely has thoughts about how useful focusing on trees as a metaphor really is. But I thought it might be fun to go through the story of how humans became humans over the course of many millions of years, and a whole ton of different hominins. We won't spend too much time on it, and it's still being established, of course. but there are pretty much three contenders for the earliest hominins who walked around doing hominin things. And so one is Chadensis, Chad, the Chad hominin, really just because this Chadensis was discovered in Chad, the country of Chad. And so Chadensis would have been around 7 million years old, for whom we have skulls. And then there's Auroran tugenensis, right, around 6 million years old. And I've only seen pictures of like a leg bone and a vertebra or something like that, you know, as Georgia was describing. And then there's Ardipithecus cadaba, which would have been between 5.8 and 5.2 million years old. So think about it, million years. And I haven't seen any fossils of that early hominin, but just from Chadensis, you can see that, you know, these hominins are still looking kind of apey, right? They have this big protruding face, big old beetle brow, big old mouth, right? You know, not looking exactly like a Homo sapien or our close hominin relatives. And then after Chadensis in that group, we have Ardipithecus ramidus. And here we are. Okay, so Ardipithecus ramidus would have walked around the Earth around 4.2 million years ago, around Ethiopia, or at least that's where a partial skeleton was found. Now, what's really interesting about these remains of, you know, Ramidus, nicknamed Ardi, by the way, was that she was pretty small, you know, about over 1.2 meters tall, so pretty small, and it looked like she lived in a wooded, you know, environment with trees. But what's really interesting about Ramidus were her feet, Ardi's feet. So she had an opposable toe, like modern apes have, right, helping them to be expert climbers, right? But the rest of her foot wasn't constructed the way that the feet of tree-dwelling apes are constructed, you know, enabling to grasp things with both their hands and feet, almost like their foot is like another hand. Instead, it looked a little bit more like our feet, the feet of a hominin that might be adapted more to walking and maybe running a bit more. She had a toe that seemed to maybe be used to sort of propel her. And she also had a pelvis that looked a bit like those that are found in later hominins, like Australopithecus afarensis, that bowl shape of the pelvis, but the rest of her pelvis looked more like a climbing ape, you know, think like chimpanzee. And so she seems to have been a great example of that transition of being a largely tree-dwelling climbing ape to something more like a bipedal hominin, like the ones, you know, you'll be seeing in some of the upcoming pictures. And so let's see if I have those ready to go. Hominin phylogeny. Oh, you know what? I guess we could just use this one, I guess.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Georgia.
Oh no, I was just remembering that picture.
Yeah, I have another one too that I actually meant to also to use because I think it's just a little bit easier to read, but we will get to that one as well. Boom, and boom. Okay. Okay. So after those ancient hominins, right, those three that we talked about, we begin to see younger hominins, or younger, 4 million years ago, like Australopithecus anamensis, afarensis, around 4 million years ago, right? And we have more sort of fossil evidence for these folks, these hominins. And so, for example, we have, gosh, this is much more difficult to juggle than I thought it was going to be. We have a lot of pictures. And so this is the infamous Lucy. Okay, so that's afarensis. And so when we also have anamensis, I'm sorry. Okay, so these are two Australopithecines. And so the darker colored skull is Lucy. Okay, and so definitely beginning to look quite a bit more like a human, right, than the ancient ancestors like Chadensis from millions of years ago. Right. And so this was already the case. Their skulls were already beginning to look more like Homo sapien, 4 million years ago. So, that was already happening, even that far back. Right. And what's interesting about understanding these ancient hominins is that they were thought to spend a fair bit of time both climbing as well as being bipedal. Right. So that transition was beginning to happen. And then, we begin to get to some of the more familiar hominins, right? Like Neanderthals and in this one, right? Neanderthals, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, heidelbergensis, and then we begin to see Homo sapiens only about 300,000 years ago. So pretty recently, if you think about it, right? And as you can see in this chart, there's a fair bit of overlap, right? So this is going through time from one side to the other, right? You can see that there's a fair bit of overlap between the various hominins, including multiple members of the genus Homo, right? And I want to bring your attention to one of those names in particular, the Denisovians. And so as you can see, it overlaps almost perfectly with Neanderthals, Heidelbergensis, another hominin, and Homo sapiens. And you can see where that little blue dot is labeled Homo longi. That's where this group of paleontologists are suggesting that they'd add Dragon Man to this family tree, that this is a distinct group of hominids, not a Neanderthal or a Denisovan or Denisovian. And they suggest it's even more closely related to Homo sapiens than either of them. But there is that debate as to whether or not this is actually a distinct hominin. And the scientists themselves acknowledge that it very well could have been a Denisovian, right? Much like Neanderthals, living humans have some Denisovian genes in our genomes. It seems like most of us are probably more closely related to Neanderthals than Denisovians. But we have that genetic heritage. And regardless of whether Dragon Man is truly a new hominin, Homo longi, or if it's a Denisovian, it's a remarkable discovery because either way, to date, the only fossils of Denisovians have been like a pinky bone, some teeth, and a shard of skull that were discovered in the Denisova cave in Siberia. And so this could be, whether it's Homo longi or if it's an intact Denisovian skull, it's massive. It's a massive discovery. Okay, so that's a little bit of our sort of, our family tree. Well, so Georgia, how do you feel about the use of the family tree as the metaphor?
I could tell you were scared to use that again. I mean, I think it's fine. I think it's a great metaphor to use. I think it's just important when we're talking about it kind of in depth like this to sort of delineate like the boundaries of how far you can take the metaphor, right? All metaphors are, sort of half lies in that they only work so far. So, but yeah, I mean, we saw in that little thing that you just showed that there's, the overlap in time, like each of those, like time is kind of marching along as you move horizontally in that figure that you showed. Time is marching along vertically in this other picture that you just put up. And so like, you could see that the different species were overlapping, but it didn't tell us anything about their evolutionary relationships to each other in that last image. I guess maybe I could just put it up so they're next to each other. But in this one in the top in the blue, it looks more like a river, right? And here we're seeing they're supposed to represent like the genetic, like the population, right? And sort of we see that, populations get bigger and smaller within a same species. And there's also some continuation over time. And when I think about evolution in terms of what's happening with the genetics over time, I often think of it more in terms of this sort of river-like image. And so actually I even have, right, like we could put this picture up with a river and we see that with rivers, much like with what actually happens in evolution, things are kind of splitting apart and then maybe parts of it are coming back together. So for example, if we think about how humans have Neanderthal DNA, humans and Neanderthals were, at one point we were separate species that had kind of split apart, but there was some interbreeding. I'm not sure when it happened. Maybe there was like a split and then interbreeding later, or maybe there was kind of always some interbreeding. But either way, that's kind of like you can look in the river and you see how channels split apart, but then other like little sub-channels come back over. And that water kind of coming back over into the Homo sapiens, for example, that's the genetic example of that would be that some of those genes that are only in the Neanderthals before actually come over and get moved into the human population through interbreeding. So if you go on like 23andMe or something like that, it'll tell you what portion of your genome is from Neanderthals, and it'll even talk about some of the physical traits you have that are maybe those genes are originally from Neanderthals. Oh, David Howden has a really good question. How are we defining
Yes,
species here? Well, defining species is really, really hard, right? Because when the
particularly for
reality looks
hominids.
like, yeah, when the reality looks like this river instead of a tree, um, it's not as easy as just chopping off branches of a tree and saying, here's one branch, here's another branch, one clean cut. We have our two separate branches we split apart. It really is this sort of flowing thing over time. And so when I use species here, I'm mostly just referring to the species that, the people who work in this field have sort of decided on. The people who work in this area have decided that
Right. And like
Neanderthals are
what
species. Yeah.
and one of the classic, simple things, to distinguish species is whether or not they can interbreed, right? If things can't interbreed, then they would be considered different species. But when it comes to hominins, not necessarily the case. So I know, like, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I would argue that humans and humanoid and hominins aren't like unique in that I don't think we have more hybridization than other mammals per se. I would say like we're studying hominins a lot more closely than we study other species and kind of like zooming in much more carefully, and that's why we find a lot of hybridization that we don't necessarily pick up in other species. It used to be that people, before we had a lot of genetic data, people thought hybridization was extremely rare and didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
And as we get more and more genetic data and start like understanding more and more about evolution, we see that hybridization happens a lot more than people think. We even have, for example, a species of salamander here in Michigan and in other parts of this region of the United States. The salamander can change its ploidy number. So humans are diploid. We get a set of genes from our mom and a set of genes from our dad. These salamanders sometimes have 5 sets of genes. And the mom will sometimes say, oh, I'm just going to lay some eggs with only like 1 set of genes and then, or 3 sets. And so it's kind of crazy that even something like how many chromosomes a species has can actually just vary tremendously now, we're learning. And that is a particularly weird case. But now I'm digressing. But the point is that
no, not at all.
Yeah. But the point is that a lot of times people think of a definition of species as they can't have hybrids that go on to reproduce, and that definition is one that is still like often widely used. But especially when we're zooming in on evolution like this, and we're talking about a period where there was a bunch of different hominin species and not all of them made it, it's kind of natural that we would see this kind of messiness in things that we're calling different species.
So that was, I didn't know that about salamanders. I was watching a video of a salamander walking last night, believe it or not. It is so strange to watch them walk. They have this like really weird gait. Anyways, I know, whatever. Yeah, they're very cool. Okay, so as we are moving towards talking about brains, I thought it might be nice to just directly compare on the same screen the skulls of these various hominins, right? And so you can see some of the comparisons between some of the hominins we've discussed so far. In one, you can see Afarensis and Africanus, those very early hominins from several million years ago. And as you can see, those skulls are still pretty small, right? Still looking a bit more tree-dwelling ape-y, right? And then we move forward and see Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Heidelbergensis, with the skull starting to get both larger and rounder, right? Still having some protruding mouths and stuff like that, but most definitely a larger brain case, which is actually the word that is used. That's the part of the skull that holds our brains. One of the rare times where a word that's used in science is actually like intelligible. But so we're starting to see larger hominids, right, with larger brains. Very cool. And then we end up at Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, the two largest brains among these hominins here, at least, with the Homo sapien brain actually being smaller than the Neanderthal brain. And as we'll explore, the sizes of the brain doesn't necessarily equate to the magnitude of intelligence. And so, let's see, do we have, yes, okay. So this is a fun study that was done. Don't worry too much about what all these colors mean. This is a comparison of a reconstruction of what the Neanderthal brain probably looked like based off of the skulls that were discovered, right? And they're comparing it to the brain of a modern human. And this was done by a group in Japan. And so they'll compare both Neanderthals and modern human brains to those of early human brains. And so
Ian, all these brains look the same to me. Could you
okay,
explain,
yes,
like, are the brains on the
yes.
top row like the humans or something, or?
Yes. Well,
Okay.
so not quite. So each
No.
column is either MH, modern human, NT, Neanderthal, EH, early human, NT, Neanderthal, and then MH, modern human versus early human. Okay. And so, worrying about the colors too much the study is quite a bit more complicated, right? But they basically found that Neanderthal brains, while they were larger, had significantly smaller cerebellums. The part of the brain that's super duper wrinkled, that's like nestled sort of under the much larger cerebrum. It's towards the back of the brain. And so the cerebellum is a very complicated anatomical structure. It's extremely dense and has some unique types of neurons that are only found there, or mostly found there. And but the cerebellum, and it's not one of the sexiest parts of the brain to study, if I'm being completely honest, but it has been shown to contribute to a huge variety of human consciousness or aspects of human consciousness, everything from mood, language, memory, particularly movement, and particularly when we learn to move. And so this was just one study that was cool that they did this kind of work. And then more recent studies have shown that, So as the
that was
brain,
a mistake on my part.
oh yeah, no worries. So it seems to be the case that the human brain probably takes longer to mature than the Neanderthal brain likely did. Okay, and so why does that matter? What that does is it opens the door to more effective, well, theoretically, to more effectively adapting to novel environments or changing environments. And that's kind of a longer story, and I'm happy to show some of the evidence that indicates that this might be the case. But one of the things that's both a challenge and an advantage of being human is that it takes quite a while for the human brain to completely mature, to finish maturing. It's not done rapidly growing and changing until we're in our 20s. And so, as a result, there's a long time for the growth of the human brain to be influenced and sculpted by the environment in which it's growing, rather than just like finishing growing within 5 years. And then, the human would just be left with what it's got, even if the tribe ends up having to or deciding to migrate out of Africa, right? And so that said, so there are definitely some anatomical differences, even just at the gross anatomical level, right? With Neanderthals having bigger brains. I mean, not massively bigger brains, but bigger brains. But when they were first discovered, they sort of got this reputation of being like the classic caveman, right? Like brutish and dumb and violent. But based on recent reviews of the available evidence of what it was like to be a Neanderthal, that just wasn't the case. They worked together, hunting as a group. They likely even herded their prey, things like bison, for example, in a way that enabled them to hunt rather effectively, very creative. They likely cooked food, gathered things like peas and acorns, pistachios, pine nuts, right? And there's some evidence that some Neanderthals, not necessarily the norm, but some Neanderthals may have even buried their dead, which is a sign of just a more complex culture or society, or potentially even spiritual beliefs. Still definitely disputed as far as I'm aware. But yeah, that reputation isn't necessarily earned as being these like brutish fools, just sort of like, walking around with clubs in their hands. But
yeah,
this
is like, it's strange to me though, because we can see like almost all those behaviors in other animals, right? We have like tool making, we have like herding, like, hyenas or something, or lions hunting down prey. And we even have, Scott's kind of making fun of elephants and their big brains, but lack of like cultural contributions. I don't know what elephant culture is like, but elephants do have something they call the elephant funeral, right? Have you heard of this?
Yeah.
Yeah, when an elephant dies, they'll like stick around for a day or so, even if it's like kind of, I don't want to say dangerous to do so, but like they're in like a droughted area and stuff and trying to make progress. They'll just kind of stay and like, I don't know, stroke the dead elephant or its bones or whatever for a while. And so it's like, oh, Neanderthals aren't dumb. They do all this stuff. I mean, we consider a lot of other animals dumb that do this stuff. So maybe,
yeah,
I don't know,
that's true. And
considering them all smarter, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, and there's no doubt that there is a difference. And so what might that difference have been, right? So we know that the Neanderthal body was just generally larger. Right? Maybe not taller necessarily, but just more massive than the Homo sapien body. And with a larger body generally speaking, comes the demand for more just brain real estate that's devoted to things that aren't necessarily directly involved in intelligence, right? Regulating just like simple body regulatory stuff, body temperature, this kind of thing, and also just controlling all that musculature. Think elephants. And so, it's possible that while the Neanderthal brain was slightly larger than Homo sapiens, much of that added real estate wasn't really doing the kind of thing that contributes meaningfully to intelligence. But if I had to guess, I'd suspect that the Homo sapien brain, while slightly smaller, likely had a larger cortex, thicker cortex, denser cortex, relative to that of the Neanderthals. And so, generally speaking, and this is an oversimplification, but generally speaking, the secret sauce of the human brain is our cortex. And so here we go. And I'm glad that Scott brought up elephants, because that's sort of central to this. And so the cortex, I should note, is the outer layer of the brain, the sort of the wrinkly part. And it's not like the human brain is the biggest brain in town, right? Not by a long shot, right? The elephant brain is significantly larger than the human brain. That makes sense. Elephants are impressively large, and they're pretty intelligent when it comes to animals. But it's a stretch to suggest that elephants are nearly as intelligent as humans. But if you look at those blue numbers on the chart on the top, right, you're seeing the numbers of neurons just within the cortex, okay? And you can see that we have more than twice as many neurons in our cortex relative to the elephant, despite the elephant brain having nearly 3 times as many neurons.
We got more bang for the buck, is what you're saying, in terms of our real estate space in our brain.
And so, yeah, the same relationship between body size and brain size applies here. Of course, that's simpler sort of comparison. The elephant brain is having to regulate this gargantuan body, while our brain is actually quite large relative to our body size, right, when compared to other animals. And I think you have, yeah.
Yeah, I just.
And so.
So this is like a chart of like the relative brain size compared to your body size. So elephants are pretty low, actually, right? Mm-hmm. Like they have really big brains, but if you control for how big their whole body is, it's like proportionally like not that big. And humans, we're in the very bottom bar. We're up there, but we're not like the biggest.
Right. So it's never going to be just like one of these things, but that is definitely a major part of the story. But when we're comparing the brains of Homo sapiens to those of other more recent hominins like Neanderthals or the Dragon Man or Denisovian, whether or not Dragon Man was a Denisovian, those ratios are going to be pretty similar, right? It's not going to be the same, obviously, but much more similar than human brain to human body versus elephant brain to elephant body. And so there is this strange thing that Homo sapiens do. And then here, I'll get this down. Okay. There's a strange thing that Homo sapiens do relative to the rest of the animal kingdom that may give us a hint as to why we have, or how these wonderful brains came to be, right? We live a rather long time. And so remember that question I asked at the beginning? So of course now, right, we live quite a long time, right? But even thousands of years ago, humans could live for many years after their reproductive age. And so from strictly,
Yeah, real quick, if I could, I think Christian brought up like a good point that I think a lot of people their minds would jump there in the beginning. He said, we live a long time because we have antibiotics and stuff. Well, like the average human lifespan has increased with time, has increased with antibiotics and stuff. You're less likely to die early because you're sick or something like that. But actually, like the maximum human lifespan hasn't changed that much, I believe that to be correct. Like
there's like a misunderstanding that like humans regularly died super young when a long time ago, but that's a sort of oversimplification of human lifespan at the time. But so if you just step back and think from a strictly evolutionary perspective, cold hard evolutionary perspective, that's kind of odd, right? Theoretically passed your genes on already. You've reached an age where you may not be quite as strong, right? Or you may be susceptible to the decline in various functions like vision, dental health for sure, bone density, right? These types of things. And so you can't necessarily contribute as much hunting or gathering, right? Or at least just not as much as in your younger years. And, in fact, as we get older, we might begin to cost our tribes more in food than we could help to produce. So why wouldn't natural selection have selected for shorter lifespans? So I think Christian also had a suggestion that I think speaks to this. So there are a few things, right? But the two explanations that are the most appealing to me, at least, and I think might help elucidate why we have these big fancy brains. So the first is child rearing, right? As Christian brought up. So just like new families who, today, who are lucky enough to be close to their grandparents, it's certainly likely that elder members of tribes back then helped to care for children. However, and this is related, and this is why I think it's important for understanding the human brain. There's also the fact that elders have amassed quite a bit of wisdom and knowledge over the years, right? And can therefore transfer that information to younger members of the tribe, right? So enabling Homo sapiens to not have to start from scratch every generation, but they could build upon the progress of past generations, right? So the transfer of information in the form of just demonstration, right? Just like showing, each other before, the emergence of language, or spoken word, then symbolic representation like art or music, right? And then ultimately writing. And so before you had Wikipedia or, the Encyclopedia Britannica, I'm old enough to remember having to use that for school, things like that, the best storage mechanism for acquired knowledge was almost certainly older members of tribes, right? And so in its earlier forms, it was likely quite rudimentary, that transfer of information. But as hominins continue to evolve towards Homo sapien, it seems likely that throughout that process, those hominins who became better and better at doing that, right, particularly as population sizes grew, those hominins would have likely had a dramatic advantage evolutionarily, right? And so what supports social interaction? The storage of knowledge, communication, and memory, our big old brains, that's what, right? And so my money is on the fact that the Homo sapien brain benefited from the expansion of our cortex, or neocortex, as well as potentially the lowly cerebellum, as we talked about when we compared the Homo sapien brain to Neanderthal, well beyond that of other hominins. And the reason for that, or more specifically, like why that'd be selected by natural selection, is still up for debate, which would be fine. But the likely reason that Homo sapiens are just so unusually versatile and adaptive probably had a lot to do with this expanding neocortex. You have Homo sapiens that have been able to fill niches that extend from like literally spending 5 minutes, 6 minutes underwater, free diving at like 80 feet underwater, right, to fish for food many thousands of years ago off the coast of South Africa, and then living in like insane altitudes in Tibet, to living in like literal just straight up snow, relying entirely on the domestication of reindeer, right, to keep from freezing and starving to death. And so, you have the development of complex relationships with unrelated animals, right? Most importantly, in my mind, the horse, but other ones as well. And so that big fancy neocortex enables all kinds of like very complicated integration anatomically. I'm talking from a neurophysiological perspective. The neocortex enables all kinds of really complicated integration of a wide variety of activity throughout the brain, enabling us to come up with complex plans, complex social organizations, divisions of labor, right? And in future plans based on memories from long ago. And so, I suspect that our hominin cousins, who were, intelligent for sure, making tools, hunting, hunting and gathering, working together, right? Doing, things like that, they probably lacked that magical ingredient that the neocortex provides for us, due to different selective pressures mixed with a different set of random mutations that that even enabled the growth of the neocortex to begin with. And I've one last thing on this specific topic to speak to Neanderthals versus humans or Homo sapiens. So we know from a cave in southern Germany that happened to have been inhabited by Neanderthals. This was work done by an archaeologist named Nick Conrad. So it was occupied by Neanderthals, and then it was abandoned, and then subsequently inhabited by Homo sapiens. We know that there is a rather significant difference in the presence of symbolic art, musical instruments, straight up musical instruments, and indications of just more abstract cognition, right? Symbolic representation, things like that. So there's something distinct there, meaningfully distinct. And whether it's attributable to the brain alone or to the environment at the different times that the cave was occupied, right? Where there are tons of predators all over the place when it came, to the Neanderthals, so they just didn't have time. It's hard to tell. But then also the size of the populations, it's another topic we can explore. I haven't seen those answers, but there's definitely evidence for a difference in higher order cognition and communication. And it's definitely reasonable to suspect that there is a meaningful anatomical and functional difference between these two hominins' brains. right, that contributed to those differences in what our ancestors left behind. So yes, I agree. I find that the sort of noble savage argument that some folks make about, you know, Neanderthals or just other hominins to be, I understand where it's coming from, but there's just evidence that there, even all, you know, many thousands of years ago, there was already a significant difference.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And just like for this, so for this Dragon Man brain, for example, like a lot was made in the media of it has a similar size brain as us, and we like, yeah, we killed off this like other intelligent species, like, or I mean, of course it was probably an intelligent species, but you know what I mean? Like maybe even smarter than we were or something like that. And so, I mean, just, yeah, you'd have to be like careful with media stuff like that. And I mean, so their brains, I thought it was interesting. So like their brains of Dragon Man is like basically kind of like shorter and longer than ours. And like ours are like the same volume, but like rounder.
Well, so that's, yeah, exactly. That's almost always the case where like humans have this unusually round brain case.
Is that because of the cerebellum or in part?
Well, I mean, it's probably a bunch of different things, right? But yeah. So if I recall correctly, I think Dragon Man would have technically had something like potentially 7% larger brain, but Neanderthals also had larger brains, right? So certainly, you know, as we've been sort of harping on here, larger brains do not mean more intelligent. And, you know, brain size does correlate with intelligence. Don't get me wrong, right? You have to have enough brain real estate to support intelligence, but it's more about the connectivity, right? It's more about how the brain is organized. And you know, I don't want to disrespect our Neanderthal cousins too much, right? It is worth keeping in mind that they were a really seriously successful hominid, right? They'd been around for a very seriously long time when we Homo sapiens barged into their neighborhoods. And so, you know, they weren't just like goofball cavemen, right, grunting at each other. They were very successful. They were around for hundreds of thousands of years. But there was something unique, something special to, well, I would argue the human brain, at least a big part of what made Homo sapiens special, that enabled us to outcompete.
Well, I've heard that a lot of it too was like the climate changing, right? Like they were better adapted for these like really cold environments. And then you have, you know, massive scale climate change with, you know, historical climate, ancient climate change with glaciers retreating, and they just, their habitat that they were the best at surviving in compared to us was going away too at the same time, possibly. Yeah.
And we know that the point at which Homo sapiens arrived to where Neanderthals were sort of were you know, their neighborhood, there was a pretty significant difference just in weaponry. So we know that Neanderthals, very strong hominins, right? And they essentially exclusively relied on thrusting spears, which takes a lot of muscular power to be able to even pull off. But Homo sapiens already had projectiles, right? They already had throwing spears, bows and arrows already. And so that already is just this dramatic mismatch in capabilities. And so, yeah, another thing that I would highlight, right, among plenty of other theories that we're not going to talk about, is the role of population sizes. The role that population size plays on the output of signs of higher order intelligence, like art, tools, these types of things. Early Homo sapiens very often left traces of their presence in the forms of things like that, right? But this was particularly the case when there were signs that tribes seemed to have reached a certain population threshold, right? So once a population reaches, I mean, I'm talking about literal numbers of people within the tribe. And so once a population reaches a certain threshold, there tends to be an explosion in these kinds of things, these you know, artifacts of intelligence. And so another reason that the human brain may have been able to continue expanding is because of just simpler advantages that enabled populations to reach a certain size, right? Enabling Homo sapiens who had been born with maybe just a slightly large, well, not Homo sapiens, but, you know, our ancestors with just a slightly larger cortex. But because they had enough people doing enough things, taking care of enough of the job of surviving, right, that those our ancestors who had just a slightly larger cortex would actually be able to exploit that newly enlarged cortex, right? If that hadn't happened, then it wouldn't have mattered whether or not, you know, Homo sapien had this fancy cortex.
Yeah, but I wonder too, like even if you have some hypothetical population where everyone is exactly the same level of intelligence, maybe once you get a certain number of people, it allows for like the degree of specialization in jobs you need, where like people can focus on what their interests are, or just it's like more efficient as a society and it frees up like time or something. I mean, very hypothetically, maybe now your encampment is big enough that like you don't like the wolves or whatever are scared away from it and you don't have to like spend as much time patrolling. So yeah, I think that, and I mean, we shouldn't ignore either. Like we don't just have genetic evolution, we have cultural transmission, like just because our language is complex enough that even in lack of sort of like genetic adaptation, if someone comes up with a good idea, and it spreads through the group, right? So if you have more people to some degree, you are going to be better able to take advantage of like those rare, really good ideas that it just takes maybe not even higher intelligence, but just chance for someone to come up with a really good idea. Yeah.
To store knowledge, right? That's the whole argument behind why it's really nice to have elders around, because they are the sort of banks of information, right? And then, yeah, divisions of labor, exactly, right? More time on your hands. But then also importantly, when you reach that number, that population threshold, social interaction becomes even more critical, right? We have essentially a primitive form of politics, but beyond just politics, just like more complex social relationships, where instead of just managing your direct familial relationships, right? Your siblings, your parents, whatever, your kids, you had cousins and nephews and nieces and aunts and uncles, and those types of extended relationships. And these are relationships about which you care deeply, inherently. And that's true throughout the entire animal kingdom, right? Like you can see a sort of preferential positive treatment of familial relationships. But when you have this big tribe, you have extended relationships that you have to juggle in your mind. You have to keep those relationships in mind. And so now the complexity at that population threshold is ballooning quite a bit. And so as a result, a hominin who could juggle, right, all of those complicated and intricate relationships would likely have had an advantage when it came to ensuring that their genes are passed on through the generations. Right? And there's a bunch of other theories, like one of the most important ones that's been around for a while is the emergence of food preparation, and particularly cooking with heat. That's certainly one of the more compelling ones, right? Which basically, in short, makes having a profoundly expensive organ, right, to have, our brain, quite a bit less expensive, right? Food preparation. And so those are some of the arguments to explain why it is that Homo sapien brains were so different relative to our hominins. Okay, so I'm going to skip the paleovirology story just because we've already been going on for a while.
I'm so curious to see what that would be, but
well, let me give you.
Come back to it, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Well, here's just a little part of it. So it turns out there's evidence that the emergence of the placenta, right? So this is going way back, much further than, further than.
Oh, you mean like when placental mammals became a thing?
Exactly, right? There's evidence that the only way that could have possibly emerged is because of an ancient infection by a retrovirus of some sort. A retrovirus is a virus that's capable of integrating into the genome of its host cell, so it becomes part of the genome. So an infection by a retrovirus of a germ cell, sperm or egg, that enabled the resulting embryo to generate this viral protein on the placenta, or on what ultimately became the placenta, enabling the placenta to interact with the embryo itself, but then also, the thing that ultimately became the womb. So yeah, pretty critical evolutionary moment, and might have been derived from viruses. But
wait,
okay.
Sorry, I got confused. So we have the placenta because the virus like wants us to have the placenta, or to protect the baby from the virus somehow?
So it's not that like the virus, obviously the virus, and I know you know this, but the virus doesn't want anything, right?
Wait, this is what the air quotes are for. Yeah.
Yeah. But, gotcha. Continue. Okay, I get that. So it basically inserted the sequence, the genetic sequence, to encode for a protein, just a protein that is one of the virus's proteins that the virus would encode to make. But because it had infected a germ cell, now those cells were capable of making that viral protein. But it just so happened that because of where it was inserted in the genome, that viral protein was expressed but it was expressed in a way that enabled for the placenta essentially to function, right, to protect the developing organism or developing fetus from the host immune system, from the mother's immune system. And so it's just sort of like this handy thing that that our ancient ancestors happened to pick up because of this, just by chance, viral infection of germ cells. It's a protein. If anybody's interested in looking into this, I'm happy to like do this topic, but it's a protein called syncytin or syncytin or syncytin. I've heard it pronounced a bunch of different ways, but yeah, syncytin is how I like to pronounce it. But yeah, syncytin, because if you look at the genetic sequence for syncytin, it looks a lot like a viral sequence, does not look a lot like other sort of the typical organisms that animals that were around at the time. So yeah, okay, we ended up doing that for longer than I thought. Syncytin, the spike protein on COVID or in SARS coronavirus 2, SARS-CoV-2, the spike protein, that's the thing that enables it to infect cells. Same kind of protein for this ancient retrovirus, right? Okay. Sorry, that is just one of my little hobby topics. But okay, so what can we learn about ourselves from this discovery of Dragon Man? So first, it is unclear as to whether or not this skull belongs to a new type of hominin. It's going to take other groups scrutinizing the skull, using other methods, perhaps even harvesting a bit of DNA, right? Because perhaps finding more remains that really, to really come to a conclusion on that specific question. And the team hasn't started trying to extract DNA from certain parts of the skull. The hardest part is usually where they get DNA, or from teeth. That's another classic place to harvest DNA to explore this Dragon Man's genome. But that would give us a much clearer picture. But we can tell that, whoever this hominin was, it had a pretty substantial brain pan, right? As we were saying, the scientists claim, yeah, it was about 7% bigger. We also know that Dragon Man was walking around, right? Hominin evolution was a far more dynamic landscape at the time. There was some overlap. We weren't the only game in town, far from it, right? There were other hominins walking around, sometimes breeding with Homo sapiens. And we know that all of us have at least a bit of Neanderthal DNA. And it varies depending on a person's unique background, but around 2% of our genome is derived from Neanderthals. And it's not like that DNA is just sitting there doing nothing, right? As Georgia was naming or was enumerating, it seems to influence things like our cardiovascular system, hair, and eye color. And there's a recent study that suggested that folks who've inherited a particular gene from Neanderthals may have offered some protection against severely reacting to COVID-19. It's pretty cool. And so we know that we also have, some of the genes from Denisovians. And so we can learn at least that much about ourselves from this new discovery. And so, there's more. I've been going on for a while. Was there something that you wanted to bring up, Georgia?
Oh, well, I was just going to say, given that the actual evidence that we have of like early human evolution is so patchy, I'll just be honest. All the points you brought up are good, right? But honestly, it is really hard to say that much that's really clear cut and meaningful just from one more skull. Like, it's really important. It's another like piece of the puzzle, but we're definitely still, as scientists, like the scientists are still putting together that puzzle. And so
what are you referring to specifically?
I just mean in terms of like tangible things. Like, you talk about like a lot about like the Neanderthals and like what genes they might have contributed. Like, it's hard to say sort of concrete things yet from this skull we found, right? Like, they haven't done genomic stuff with it. Like, we don't have that many others. Maybe if we find more Denisovian skulls, then we'll be able to say more like whether it is or is not a Denisovian or something different, or whether Denisovians are all the same thing. So like unfortunately, like, because all the skull data is so like that there's so few fossils, especially when you sort of like zoom into like very close human relatives, Homo sapien relatives, that like it's really, it's so amazing to have like a skull that's like so complete, except for his teeth, which is weird because often the teeth are like the only thing you find, but the skull minus teeth, that's very complete. I think like the genetic work will be really cool to look at and see when they
exactly that's what I was saying. Until that sequencing is done, we're not going to really come to a conclusive answer, right? Okay, so another thing that that has sort of, I think, been internalized by a lot of people is what has come to be called the killer ape theory. Okay. And so some of the evidence that has been collected has helped us to understand that, so it's this internalized concept that of early hominins, that our ancestors were fundamentally warlike and violent. And there's some evidence to suggest that that's at least somewhat misguided. So, again, this is called the violent ape or the killer ape theory. And this was based off of, here we go. This is based off of a discovery of a skull cap of a young hominin, Paranthropus robustus. And so that was found in a cave in South Africa. And so you can see what look like those two little punctures on the skull. And those punctures were interpreted as being the injuries of violent clashes between other hominins who were using weapons. Okay. And so, one of the earlier models began to be that early hominins were warlike and violent, right? But there's more to the story. So subsequently, another scientist, Sherwood Washburn, he noted that predators in general in that area seem to consume their prey in ways that looked a lot like the injuries that are seen in this skull and other skulls that were found nearby, right? And so Washburn's argument, and I love the name Sherwood. It's like Sherwood Washburn. It's like such a classic name. So, rather than being the byproduct of violent clashes between other hominins, instead, it may just have been that these early hominins were actually the victims of nearby predators. And so, in other words, we weren't necessarily the inheritors, or we aren't the inheritors of like violent clashes between hominins alone, right? We're actually inheriting the legacy of hominins who struggled to avoid being prey. Or at least that's what Washburn would argue. We're not necessarily the byproduct of hominins who were inherently driven to fight one another, right? We're the byproduct of hominins who had to learn to work together to survive, right? And hunt and reproduce, and work collaboratively to avoid being devoured by predators that were stronger, faster, and larger. And in this case, including gigantic birds, which is what some of the more recent analyses of this skull cap suggest were the cause of this the skull punctures. I mean, can you imagine having to like avoid gigantic birds that would attack you and kill your children? Pretty freaky. But yeah. So that that model, that predator prey model of early hominins, and it also I tried to emphasize this. I don't know if I did, but those early hominins were quite a bit smaller than modern humans. But that predator-prey relationship is one of the other theories to explain why it is that hominin brains continued getting larger and more complex and versatile over time. It was tricky business being an early hominin, right, with all those predators around. They had to adapt to avoid being outcompeted by those nearby predators, and so they had to work together. And they relied oftentimes on a strategy like persistence hunting, basically exhausting their prey rather than being faster or stronger. And if you've ever wondered why it is that humans are so hairless or furless, whereas the other primates that we see all are all quite hirsute, we all the prey that they would have been hunting persistently, right, would more rapidly start to overheat, right? Covered in all that fur, not being able to sweat nearly as much as humans. They can sweat, but not nearly as much. And we're just covered in sweat glands, whereas they don't have as many. And so that strategy likely supported the development of more complex cognition because it requires more complex strategies than just like seeing your prey, attacking your prey, eating it, all within a couple of minutes, even if you're working with other members of your species or whatever, your group. So yeah.
There's a lot of different story directions that are happening right now all together. I think we definitely need to expand this topic in the future, maybe. But yeah, I mean, I feel like you're giving a lot of really good and interesting reasons for like a lot of different features that we have. Another one that I came across though regarding the brain size is that, it's actually just also sort of harder to change your brain and head size than it is to change the size of the rest of your body, right? So there's another study I found where, I don't have it up right now and I don't remember who it was, but there's another study talking about like relative brain size and intelligence. And basically just the brain size can kind of be lagging behind evolutionarily sometimes. So you mentioned like our very, very early ancestors were small and then, they were growing to be bigger. Well, their brains might have been relatively smaller just because their brains hadn't kind of caught up with their body size yet. And that's actually one of the explanations too for why Homo sapiens might kind of have bigger brains, because we supposedly were our recent ancestors were bigger, and we were in the process of getting smaller perhaps, but our brains, we still have these like big old bobbleheads that hadn't like quite shrunk down yet. So so there can be, I always like to highlight, like there's good sort of stories and reasons for things, like evolutionary reasons, but also sometimes it's just like, evolution is trying to catch up. Evolution is not perfect. And I know, Ian, that we had talked about doing an episode, maybe our next episode will be one on this kind of lag of evolution, which often, if you've heard of the term vestigial traits, those are traits that kind of got left behind by evolution, right? Things that we still have, features we still have, just because our ancestors had it, not because they're necessarily useful to us anymore. So like the appendix is an example that gets thrown around of this, and like our tailbones and things like that too.
Right on. Yeah. So what else can we learn? So we talked about our sort of shared heritage that we have with Neanderthals, Denisovians, and other hominins, and just like the concepts of early hominins just being violent and brutish alone, it's also mistaken to think that Homo sapiens are entirely distinct and unconnected from our hominin cousins. Right? There's a fair bit of interbreeding between hominins, tens of thousands of years ago, and we all carry the legacy of those other hominins within our own genomes. Right? They contribute some of the genes that make us who we are today. So again, somewhere like 2% of genomes can be traced back to Neanderthals mating with early Homo sapiens. Something like 5% of Australian Aboriginal population genomes are composed by Denisovian genes, and a lower percentage, but a percentage nonetheless, of people living throughout Asia and the Americas. And so John Hawkins, who's an anthropologist at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and he makes the same argument that Georgia was making, that rather than seeing, thinking of us as having like a family tree, think of it more as braided rivers, right? All flowing in and out of each other, contributing water here and there. We've inherited genes from a whole variety of other hominins who were sculpted by different selective pressures, different environments, but it is this shared genetic heritage. By the way, another thing that I always, find fascinating to recognize is that without that interbreeding, it's possible that Homo sapiens could have become so inbred that our survival could have been compromised, right? It's strange to consider, but humans are actually unusually inbred relative to other primates. Chimpanzees and orangutans, for example, they are much more genetically diverse than humans are. And it seems like all humans are the byproduct of like a small single tribe that, which some evidence suggests is the case, that made it. And so without Neanderthals and Denisovians, perhaps including, Dragon Man or maybe not, spicing up the genetic pot a little bit, humans, wouldn't have benefited from, some almost certainly needed genetic diversity. And so Hawkins suggests that like the ability for humans to adapt to high altitudes may very well have been inherited from Denisovians. And more importantly, we might have inherited a more versatile immune system because, those other hominins' immune systems would have been sculpted by the unique pathogens that they would have encountered in their unique environments. And so not only did it just like happen, but it was probably really advantageous for us. So Dragon Man is a beautiful specimen for sure. Everybody agrees on that. And we're going to have to wait to see how the rest of the field, particularly geneticists and so on, integrate and interrogate this finding more closely, right? But whether it's a Denisovian or Homo longi, what we know for sure is it is this echo, right, from our evolutionary past. So with that, do you have any closing thoughts, Georgia? Oh, please.
Oh no, one thing right off that is that, one of the articles I was mentioned, someone was saying that like, I bet that there's a bunch of hominin fossils, not just in the ground, but like also in museums that might actually, now that we have this Dragon Man skull, it might give a lot of the fragmented fossil data we have, like more meaning. It might help us interpret some of that other data better. And like once we get, you know, genetic information too, possibly from this Dragon Man, we might be able to see like, oh, these other fossil fragments actually belong with Dragon Man. And then like that's where like the more pieces of the puzzle like start coming together. And so Dragon Man could enhance the knowledge of like the fossils that we have already found, and just by way of helping things fall into place, kind of.
Right on. So you know, in closing, for me, you know, the discoveries like these are deeply encouraging to me. I'm like an optimist when it comes to humans. You know, it's obviously not hard to find examples of humans doing terrible things to each other, to other animals, and to our environment. Of course, if you happen to have opened Twitter in the past couple of days, you'll have seen a giant burning inferno opening up in the Gulf of Mexico due to things that humans do. You know, it's never a terrible bet to be kind of cynical about humanity, but humans, and really humans alone, have produced some of the most beautiful, amazing, transcendent things that have existed on this planet, right? We're an incredibly successful species. And we're the descendants of some unusually clever and, you know, courageous and creative apes. And I still think that, you know, despite all of the human deficits, of which there are many that are manifest all over the place, the beauty of humanity dominates those deficits. And so, you know, earlier hominins and apes are you know, worthy of admiration and appreciation. But you know, I'm optimistic that we'll figure out a way to emphasize that beauty moving forward as we, you know, continue evolving. But all right, with that, I'd like to thank Georgia very much for joining all of us today. Everybody really ought to subscribe to George's channel here on haps.tv. And you know, I can tell you from experience that it can be a lot of fun to join someone as they're wrapping up their PhD. So be sure to check out you know, George's channel. And you know, as she was saying, hopefully this will be the first of several, at least, topics that you know, we've already actually talked about doing in the future, like the vestigial anatomy.
Hopefully, some more evolution, cognition stuff in the future for me and Ian together. And then if you're like feeling hungry for another skull episode, I had one from a little while back now that was I guess that skull. So I was working with like some skull data and giving hints on it while people try to like figure out what it is. And so I will leave that on the table for you.
That's awesome. And I should also note that I'm going to be interviewing the lead scientist on a study that I talked about on the brain basis of creative expression of musicians. And I talked about that a couple of weeks ago, who himself is a musician here in Philadelphia. So that should be fun in a couple of weeks. But with that, thanks so much for watching, everyone. Happy 4th, if that's a thing you celebrate. I will see you next week. And so thanks so much for everybody, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.